The title is the topic. Today I'm talking about false narratives.
Welcome to our multi-part video series exploring the roles and representations of feminist frequency. This project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with Keesian from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
This is the third part of a series of response videos to Anita Sarkeesian's recent speech, Hate and Heroism. I already did 2 videos on this topic.
So if you haven't seen it yet, please check that one out before continuing to watch this one.
With that said, let's begin.
Number 3. The denial of women's professional expertise. When women do break through the barriers to participation in male-dominated spaces, we find our expertise ignored, contested, or outright denied.
I'll judge your expertise based on what you present here and what I know about you and your work to see if the issues I have with you are due to your gender or what you present.
And we face intense scrutiny and aggressive demands that we defend our contributions in ways that our male peers do not.
You are the one who makes a lot of claims about video games and cites scientific studies. Your work has also been used in classrooms.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms and screened at film festivals.
And you have introduced curriculum to Common Core. Is gaming a boys' club? The type of work you present actually needs to be scrutinized, but oddly enough, your work that has so many issues gets overlooked due to the harassment narrative because, oh, that poor girl. In fact, I'd argue your work is not given the scrutiny it needs by people who push it because of your gender.
Studied extensively.
And the sad part is, people keep pushing it despite the fact it's all based on a bunch of lazy research.
So, here's one last reality. I'm an expert on the depictions of women in video games.
An expert, you say? So let's see what Anita says about her qualifications.
In addition to playing games for most of my life, I've spent the last 3 years researching and examining the representations of women throughout the history of video games. I've discussed and analyzed over 300 different games in my Tropes vs. Women series thus far. As a leading expert in this field, I'm regularly sought after for media commentary on gaming topics and hired by developers and publishers to consult on upcoming titles.
Well, those sound like impressive credentials. However, if experience and time involved are major factors in being an expert, perhaps I could consider myself an expert on your work. Let's see what myself, as a self-proclaimed expert on tropes versus women in video games, has to say.
Women are socialized to be timid about our achievements, but I think it's important to own our success. I know my stuff, and I'm pretty good at what I do.
Since you're trying to own your success and prove yourself, I'll wait till after you make your case before I present a great deal of what I have to say.
Despite this fact, there's a widespread perception among mostly male gamers that I somehow still don't understand the games I analyze, and therefore intentionally misleading my viewers.
Myth: Anita doesn't understand video games. You may understand some about video games, but I could say a lot right now about whether you intentionally misled your viewers. However, let's continue with your speech.
Any Google search for my name will return thousands of YouTube videos from men who have obsessively combed through every frame of my videos in a desperate attempt to try and find that one smoking gun, which will then invalidate all of my criticisms once and for all.
I agree, there are too many people who obsess over you. What I've noticed is a lot of the people who respond to you don't even review your videos. They just want to give an opinion on you. When I first started, the intent was always to review your work and discredit your videos, and I have reviewed the 6 monstrosities that you already had released when I first started. The vast majority of people responding to you have never reviewed your videos, and of those who have, only some make really good responses. And what you said about the smoking gun.
In a desperate attempt to try and find that one smoking gun, which will then invalidate all of my criticisms once and for all.
I have seen this since I started, and going through her history, it's apparent it's been like this since the beginning. Some of the things I can name off the top of my head. There was the stolen Let's Play footage, not a fan of video games, teleseminar background, going after her 501c3 nonprofit status, various things about her Kickstarter, and various other conspiracies around her. It's not that these aren't worth discussing, but a lot of these don't discredit her work. You have to discredit her work, yet most people seem more interested in attacking her character. You have to attack her arguments, not her. make it about her work, not her. For instance, a lot of people who obsess over the not a fan of video games clip have never done a proper review of her videos. And I've seen over and over again where people try to present these smoking guns as if that one thing she did or said invalidates all her arguments.
This magic bullet piece of evidence they seem to believe will thereby free them from having to consider the possibility that sexism may be a problem in gaming.
The thing is, Anita, people do this magic bullet stuff because they either don't like you or think you are wrong. Even if sexism exists in gaming, it does not mean you are right about everything. Yet here you are acting as if you're right about everything you say, despite your lies, manipulation, and lazy research.
Studied extensively.
Needless to say, they have not found their smoking gun.
She's right about that. No one has defeated her. This is why I do as much as I do, because you have to spar at her level. You can't do the bare minimum or produce subpar responses and expect to change anyone's mind.
My analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked. It has to be, given the intense level of scrutiny focused on my every word. This is one of the main reasons why each episode takes so long to produce.
Oh, Anita, how much you will regret saying that by the time we get to the end of this video.
Still in the comments, under any internet article that mentions my work, you will find a flock of angry gamers pointing to one game in particular as that magic bullet supposedly proving my ignorance of all things video games. That game is called Hitman Absolution.
Anita will be talking about a video Thunderfoot released called Anita Sarkeesian Busted, where he talks in depth about the misrepresentations on Anita's part. I've read a lot of comments and articles about your work. While Hitman Absolution may be referenced a lot, so are many other things. In fact, after your recent E3 rant, a lot of people were talking about what you had to say about those games. Your history also shows problems in the comment section of articles long before Thunderfoot released that video.
Now, I've spent quite some time playing this game, and it's a strange choice to try to use to debunk me, because it employs pretty much every sexist trope in the book. I mean, the game opens with a mission in which the player character shoots a naked, unarmed woman while she's taking a shower. And it only goes downhill from there.
It does not matter if it has almost every trope in the book, because Thunderfoot's arguments are about misrepresentations of Hitman Absolution. He's questioning your honesty.
Okay, so the claim that I misrepresented this game is a particularly dishonest strawman argument.
If it's a fact you misrepresented this game, then it is not a strawman argument. If that's the case, what you are doing right now is committing a logical fallacy called poisoning the well. Poisoning the well, also known as discrediting, smear tactics. To commit a preemptive ad hominem attack against an opponent. That is, to prime the audience with adverse information about the opponent from the start in an attempt to make your claim more acceptable or discount the credibility of your opponent's claim. Let's see what you have to say about Thunderfoot.
It originates from a 42-year-old YouTube user who, by all accounts, hasn't played the game at all, hasn't played Hitman at all, but is obsessed with ranting against feminism.
So now you're making the same claim others make about you, that he may not have played the game. Given the fact evidence came forward you stole Let's Play footage, you should be the last one lecturing about whether playing the game is a requirement to make a critique. As far as an obsession about ranting about feminism, you're the person who seems obsessed with ranting about video games and sexism.
His video entitled Anita Sarkeesian Busted is by far the most viewed video in the flourishing debunking feminist frequency subgenre on YouTube, which has itself turned into quite the cottage industry.
The professional victim shtick has turned into quite the cottage industry itself. I could argue that both you and Thunderfoot have set trends as to how to become popular and profit from it. The question is, why is it a problem when himself and others do it, but it's not a problem when yourself and others do the same?
His video is brimming with logical fallacies, but its popularity with male gamers does provide us with a useful example to deconstruct.
Your videos are brimming with lies and manipulation, but their popularity with feminists have provided me with useful examples to deconstruct.
So, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to first show you a brief clip of part of my original argument from my Women as Background Decoration miniseries. You're about to see 1.5 minutes from an hour-long analysis in which I discuss the ways in which sexual objectification is coded into game systems in many open-world or sandbox-style games. Here I'm addressing sexually objectified NPCs or non-player characters that are designed to be malleable, vulnerable, or disposable.
To keep this video review shorter, I'm cutting this part out. It's not necessary to show the entire clip for my responses, and you can always go watch the original video if you want.
So, a bunch of gamers were very unhappy about my analysis and allege that my video is deliberately misleading. They claim that the game does not encourage players to attack civilians, but instead punishes players for such actions. And therefore, by showing footage of the player character killing exotic dancers, that I was deceptively trying to make the game appear sexist. Everything about this claim is false.
Is it false, though? Given everything I've pointed out in my video reviews, I find it difficult to believe you don't deliberately misrepresent games to make developers and their games look more nefarious than they really are.
It's common for strawman arguments like these to focus on minute details, which are then blown out of proportion in an attempt to create a scandal.
It's also common for you to focus on minute details in video games and blow them out of proportion to make things look more sexist than they are.
If you're not familiar with these kinds of games, I'm going to get a tiny bit technical about game mechanics for a moment, so bear with me. First, in my video, the exotic dancers are not being killed, they're being pacified, which is what the game calls it when you knock someone out without killing them. The game indicates this in the top left-hand corner of the screen.
Technically, Thunderfoot did talk about killing, but his main point was you are penalized for your actions.
The player cannot help but treat these female bodies as things to be acted upon.
That is, the game actively disincentivizes killing random people like the girls in the strip club.
Games that penalize you for certain actions do not actively encourage you to do so. It's actually a failsafe to discourage that behavior. But you said this.
Because they were designed, constructed, and placed in the environment for that singular purpose. Players are meant to derive a perverse pleasure from desecrating the bodies of unsuspecting virtual female characters.
They were also designed to be bypassed if you choose not to pacify them and desecrate their bodies.
So I watched a playthrough of the missions, of which there were plenty. I watched about 40 or so of these people playing the mission. Turns out there are two ways of doing it, and only one of those takes you past the girls doing their makeup, and one doesn't.
It is completely optional.
Next, the game does not punish players for non-lethal pacification. The point system in Hitman Absolution functions as a way to track performance stats. It has nothing to do with success or failure of the mission. All you need to do to pass a level is to kill your intended target and get out alive.
Whether you succeed or not, you hit on one point I want to cover.
The point system in Hitman Absolution functions as a way to track performance stats.
If the point section is put there with the explicit intent of tracking performance stats.
Players are then invited to explore and exploit those situations during their playthrough.
So I could argue they are also encouraged not to exploit those situations if they want to have a better performance and overall better score.
Furthermore, the game provides ways to negate minor statistical penalties. In fact, if you keep watching my playthrough, you'll notice that the 140-point pacification deduction is nullified when the unconscious bodies are hidden inside one of the many containers that the game designers have placed in each level for that purpose, meaning there is no penalty. This is really basic stuff in the Hitman series.
Earlier, you said this about female bodies.
The player cannot help but treat these female bodies as things to be acted upon, because they were designed, constructed, and placed in the environment for that singular purpose.
If they were designed for the singular purpose of being acted upon, why did they design a mechanic to hide the body?
When the unconscious bodies are hidden inside one of the many containers that the game designers have placed in each level for that purpose.
It's very possible some of this stuff is set up to give the players the possibility of messing up and allowing them to recover, or as a challenge for the players to avoid to have a perfect score by the end. What I'm getting at is these things aren't always set up and designed for the purpose you laid out in your original videos. Now you're trying to reframe things to give the perception you were originally right when you may have been wrong.
Studied extensively.
Finally, the assertion that the game does not encourage players to attack civilians is simply incorrect.
I watched about 40 or so of these people playing the mission. Turns out there are two ways of doing it, and only one of those takes you past the girls doing their makeup, and one doesn't.
It most certainly does, both implicitly and sometimes explicitly. Hitman Absolution is what's called a stealth sandbox game. That means it's designed to be played in many different ways.
So about 3/4 went the easier route, and about 1/4 went past the dancers.
For example, each level includes multiple ways to kill each target. It's essentially a playground for creative violence.
Most of them sneaked past the dancers like you're meant to do.
In fact, the only options provided for interaction with most characters are to either murder them or subdue them.
And none of them actually attacked or killed the dancers.
Neutralizing NPCs is a core mechanic in the Hitman series. It's often necessary in order to clear a path to objectives or prevent a character who's seen you from raising the alarm.
And none of them actually attacked or killed the dancers.
One of Thunderfoot's main points about this game was you can skip some of the NPCs. Sometimes it's optional to incapacitate them. Whether it's mandatory depends on the NPC and the circumstances.
In this stage, for example, there's a specific challenge that explicitly encourages players to knock out a stripper and drag her body out of the line of sight. This action then allows the player to hide inside the stripper cake and wait for the targets to arrive before popping out and murdering them all in slow motion. The whole point of the game is to offer a wide range of possibilities for experimentation, which is why even if you murder civilians, you don't get a game over.
Stating facts about a particular mission or objective does not refute your lies and manipulation.
Saying that this game doesn't want players to interact with civilians in the only ways that are provided is like saying that Grand Theft Auto discourages players from stealing cars because sometimes they get a police wanted level for doing so. In Grand Theft Auto.
Saying this game explicitly encourages you to do things when most players skip that particular aspect of a game.
And none of them actually attacked or killed the dancers.
Sometimes they act that way on civilians because it's mandatory. Other times they just skip NPCs if it's optional. Grand Theft Auto may have been designed with the intent of stealing cars, but Hitman encourages you to be stealthy or it wouldn't penalize you for not doing so. Even if it's a violent game with lots of fighting and killing, you are not properly representing the entire intent of the game.
The developers obviously put a tremendous amount of work into designing and implementing these systems. They didn't do so with the hopes that no player would ever use them. As I said in my original video on the topic, game systems and everything in them, including sexually objectified female characters, exist to be played with. So there's absolutely no truth to the allegation that I misrepresented this game.
Not only did you misrepresent the game, you misrepresented the developers.
It's a rush streaming from a carefully concocted mix of sexual arousal connected to the act of controlling and punishing representations of female sexuality.
A lot of these things you can do to NPCs that are not female, and I didn't see any evidence that this was a carefully concocted mix of sexual arousal. That makes the developer sound like misogynists.
Those who repeat these false claims do not understand my argument, or perhaps more likely, they are just trying to pass off bad faith straw man arguments as legitimate criticism, while making no real attempt to engage with the substance of my analysis.
I think I understand your arguments, and you are the one who doesn't want to engage anyone about your work. Even in this speech, there is no dissenting voice. It's just you telling everyone you are right and all your critics are wrong.
Now, obviously, good faith, respectful, constructive criticism of women's work can be useful and valuable.
It feels like when I produce arguments that are in good faith, respectful, constructive, useful, or valuable, you tend to ignore me. You seem like the kind of person who would go behind a critic's back in a failed attempt to defend your work against criticism instead of facing them.
But that's not what we're talking about here.
You're right, we aren't talking about that. You handpick what you want to respond to and ignore everything else.
Accusing women who are in fact experts in their field of ignorance or intentional deceit because you don't like the conclusions they reach in their work is used as a way to discredit and discount perspectives that challenge the status quo.
I'll address this section at the end.
Automatically assuming ignorance when women speak on video games, technology, science, politics, or other subjects typically associated with male-dominated arenas is a form of sexism.
That is sexism, but calling people out on lies and manipulation is not sexism, it's rational thinking. It's logical to not accept lies and manipulation when you know they are just that.
Now, of course, the conspiracies and straw man arguments I've outlined in this talk are without merit and not even worth responding to on their own. However, they do illustrate an underlying pattern.
You're right that some of these things aren't worth responding to, and there is a pattern of how people respond to you and the things they come up with. But you have a pattern of finding ways around addressing valid criticism, such as this speech where you pick a bunch of nonsense and lump it all together to give the impression that all of your criticism is like this and none of it has validity.
The denial of women's accomplishments, experiences, and expertise works to underpin gender inequality and lays the foundation for other forms of harassment and abuse by providing a self-justifying narrative for these behaviors.
The pattern that always arises from people who lie and manipulate is they draw an audience of people who call them out. The longer this goes on, the more people will call you out. The more famous you get, the more people come along who will call you out. Just because some of these people harass you does not mean they're all wrong about you.
So in my case specifically, men can tell themselves a story in which their anger and hostility towards a feminist games critic is justified because she's just the puppet of a man, or she can't even turn on a controller, or she lied about Hitman.
Just as people who harass you keep justifying their behavior, you keep justifying your lies, manipulation, and lazy research.
Studied extensively.
And as long as you keep this up, it will always follow you. You cannot get rid of people who are critical of you when they know you are wrong.
And whether in workplaces or online spaces, men who undermine and belittle women justify it to themselves by saying, I'm not doing this because she's a woman, it's just because she's unqualified, incompetent, or undeserving of her position.
Or because you're a liar, manipulator, or had your fame and fortune handed to you on a silver platter because, oh, that poor girl.
This is a delusional but self-justifying fiction in which men convince themselves that women deserve any mistreatment they receive.
It's a delusion, but self-justifying fiction that some women convince themselves that any criticism they receive from men is all sexism and none of it is legitimate.
But I want to stress that the undermining of women's work is not only a problem when it results in harassment. The constant resistance women encounter in male-dominated spaces may often be subtle, but the repercussions of these discrediting tactics are far-reaching, and the emotional, psychological, and professional toll these constant denials and attacks take on women are severe and impossible to quantify.
Harassment and sexism is bad, but people who lie and manipulate will always be resisted because people don't like being lied to or manipulated.
All of this is a contributing factor to the abysmally low ratio of women working in traditionally male-dominated fields, particularly those involving technology.
Even if that is a contributing factor, there are plenty of other factors ideologues like you exclude from discussion because it doesn't fit the narrative. That, however, would be for another discussion.
Women learn to doubt their own talent and skills, internalizing the belief that they don't belong in these spaces. The constant undermining and microaggressions, as well as straight-up harassment, pressure many women to abandon their professional fields altogether. And by ensuring that these fields remain places in which women are not viewed or treated as equals, these devaluing tactics work to shore up the status quo, limiting the opportunities for women to gain entry to these spaces and actively maintaining male dominance, making it impossible to reach true gender equity.
When that happens, it's sad, but when you exclude all those factors, there are still issues with your work, and you keep hiding behind your gender. Those who cry the loudest for equal treatment cry the loudest when they receive equal treatment.
What's insidious about these more subtle forms of sexism is that oftentimes men don't even realize they're participating in them. As the great Howard Zinn famously said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." Men must step up and counteract the doubt and marginalization that so often greets women's voices. Of course, this is easier said than done. It requires men to do the conscious and intentional work of listening to women, recognizing women's contributions, and actively giving women the benefit of the doubt.
I have stepped up and spoken against your other critics in the past, but as far as giving women the benefit of the doubt, I can only tolerate so much lies and manipulation before I think this listen and believe nonsense is used as an excuse to label critics as people who aren't listening. All I've seen is anyone, male or female, can and will lie and manipulate to get ahead.
The cultural norms of male-dominated spaces can be changed, and those spaces can be transformed into equitable environments that are welcoming, supportive, and respectful for people of all genders. Thank you.
There's so much that could be said about that one section. Yes, sexism may exist, but there are several other factors that go into why some of these spaces are male-dominant to begin with, and why it continues to be that way. I'm not going into a detailed discussion as that could take an entire video. Anita talks a little bit after this in response to some questions that I'm not going to cover. What I do want to cover is some of her claims, so let's go over this.
In addition to playing games for most of my life, I've spent the last 3 years researching and examining the representations of women throughout the history of video games.
While that's true of the last 3 years, going back to your infamous Bayonetta review, you said the recut version was uploaded because in the original cut of the video, I made a few jokes about the game that were misunderstood, poorly worded. It led to harassment. There were actually factual errors in that video, such as this one.
First, the positive things about the game. She's a single mother, and that's kind of it. So on to the negatives.
Bayonetta was not a single mother, yet you listed that as a positive. I'm not going to do a full review of that video, but evidence suggests you didn't have much knowledge about that game before you talked about it. Then you uploaded a recut version and made it unlisted. That is suspicious. Now let's jump ahead to your Kickstarter and beyond.
I've discussed and analyzed over 300 different games in my Tropes vs. Women series thus far.
Going to your damsel in distress list on your Tumblr, you didn't start cataloging games until January 2013. Half a year after your Kickstarter ended, and about a month after you were supposed to be done and have DVDs out to your top backers, you just started documenting these games. Kind of lazy if you ask me.
Studied extensively.
Not to mention that it is the only trope you have a catalog of. All of your other tropes are missing such in-depth record keeping, almost like your research got lazier as time went on.
As a leading expert in this field, I'm regularly sought after for media commentary on gaming topics and hired by developers and publishers to consult on upcoming titles.
A leading expert who spends almost half of her time talking about harassment while some of her backers are complaining about the lack of videos. Your project isn't even complete, yet you already define yourself as an expert.
Despite this fact, there's a widespread perception among mostly male gamers that I somehow still don't understand the games I analyze, and therefore intentionally misleading my viewers.
You have a history of not understanding some video games you talk about. However, I'll tell you how I think you intentionally mislead your viewers, but it'll take a minute. In your damsel in distress videos, you said the conventional tropes are not part of the trope itself.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself. So the woman in question may or may not play the victim role for the entire game or series, while our brave hero may or may not be successful in his rescue attempt. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero for the benefit of his story arc.
Then, in Ms. Male Character, the traditional conventions were part of the trope, it just isn't always used.
Childlike hair decorations are by far the most frequent accessory used for this purpose. It's standard practice for creators to just put a bow on top of anthropomorphized animals or personified objects in order to communicate that a character is not male. The color coding of characters is another frequently used visual element to signify gender. Typically, the dominant color used in the design of the female variant is bright pink, although sometimes a purple or pastel palette may be used. Gender signifiers are not mandatory for the Ms. Male Character trope to be in effect, but these types of stereotypical attributes do serve to mark female characters as decidedly different by virtue of their feminine presentation.
But using your damsel in distress argument in your Ms. Male Character video,
let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the Ms. Male Character is often grouped with other separate tropes, including childlike hair decorations and the bright pink, although sometimes a purple or pastel palette may be used. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of Ms. Male Character trope itself.
you seem to pick and choose what does and doesn't count and change the rules to suit your fancy. Your damsel in distress videos attack the trope from almost every angle. It's like your videos are an instruction manual on how to get rid of the trope in its traditional sense, yet oddly enough...
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
It just has to conform to a specific set of rules before it's considered acceptable.
The good news is that there's nothing stopping developers from evolving their gender representations and making more women heroes in their future games. It'd be great to finally see Zelda, Sheik, and Tetra as the protagonists of their own games.
I've seen people try to argue away the CDI games as not counting, which is similar to something you and Macintosh do a lot. You try to argue how you are always right, even when you are wrong. But you still want Zelda and Peach as a lead protagonist in a full-on console adventure.
And not just mobile DS games, I'm talking full-on console adventures.
Except on mobile or DS systems.
And not just mobile DS games.
Which happens to be a system where Peach is already the star and lead protagonist. I'm gonna stop here and make my point, as this could go on for quite a while. The point I'm trying to make is you intentionally mislead your viewers with manipulation. Your videos are so well crafted that it's actually a challenge to discredit some of your arguments. And even at that, people have to research to know when you are lying or to at least know your research is lazy.
Studied extensively.
My analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked. It has to be, given the intense level of scrutiny focused on my every word. This is one of the main reasons why each episode takes so long to produce.
You claimed in your Kickstarter update these are like a master's level thesis. You didn't have a damsel in distress list till half a year after your Kickstarter ended, and didn't even have any videos released till months after you were supposed to be finished. And here we are 3 years later, and you are still working on it. I'd say you and Jonathan McIntosh spend more time discussing how to BS people rather than proving your claims. Now, as far as double and triple checking things,
my analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked.
When I started reviewing your videos, I noticed you had 2 sets of numbers for how many games were in all 3 Damsel in Distress videos, 183 and 192. Then, in your Kickstarter update, you said it was 182 games.
My analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked.
Triple check worked with 3 sets of numbers.
Studied extensively.
There have also been flaws and typos in your work that I'm not going to cover in this video. I took an interest in responding to your videos because I thought I had some interesting stuff to say and could tackle your work from different angles than other people have. This was the defining moment.
There's often a lot of hostility towards watching TV, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains, but I don't think that's true. Compounding the problem is the widespread belief that, despite all the evidence, exposure to media has no real-world impact.
After that realization, I checked more into your scientific studies and found your in-depth analysis to be lacking. And the deeper I dug, the worse I found your work to be.
Accusing women who are in fact experts in their field of ignorance or intentional deceit because you don't like the conclusions they reach in their work is used as a way to discredit and discount perspectives that challenge the status quo.
You had your conclusions before your Kickstarter and then looked for the evidence. That is called confirmation bias. I came to my conclusions about your work after some research. Although I never uploaded the first video I made about you, the first one I did upload tackles your scientific studies. I have done more than enough to challenge your claims and refute your arguments. You are the one who is being ignorant because you don't like the conclusions that I came to. And with that said, this ends my multi-part series. If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.
Oh, did I win?